have told the Egyptians that we would like to see is a prompt return to democratic governance through an inclusive process. Now that means several things. That means engaging in a dialogue with all parties, and we can't engage in a dialogue with all of the parties if some of those parties are currently being detained. So we've called for the release of all those who've been detained for political purposes. It's going to require Egyptian authorities to respect the rights of Egyptian citizens, including the freedom of expression and the right to a peaceful assembly. That these are all civil rights, basic civil rights, that democratic governments respect around the world. And we will hold the interim Egyptian government and the Egyptian authorities that are currently in power accountable for protecting those rights.
And then next snapping, Carter, if I could go over to politics for a moment.
Okay.
As the president, as the leader of the Democratic Party, does he have an opinion on whether or not Anthony Weiner should stay or go as far as the race is concerned?
Not one that I've heard. Major?
I want to get you to say something I think you're saying, but you haven't said directly. The administration believes the Egyptian military is principally responsible for the bloodshed in the streets in Egypt. Yes or no?
Well, what we have said is we condemn in no uncertain terms the violence and bloodshed that we saw.
Who's most responsible for it?
Well,
the Muslim Brotherhood is unequivocal about who's responsible for this. They're being killed in the street by the military that ousted the democratically elected president. Does White House agree?
Well, one of the things that we have said is that we are supportive of an independent inquiry into the actions that occurred over the weekend. But that kind of violence and bloodshed that we've seen is unacceptable. And it is why it is what prompted phone calls from Secretary Kerry to his counterpart. It's what prompted phone calls from Secretary Hagel to General al-Sisi to make sure that there is no ambiguity associated with our
view here in this White House that by not declaring this a coup and not suspending aid, that the military interpreted that as a green light to carry forward with some of its confrontation with the Muslim Brotherhood that has resulted in this violence?
Of course not. And the reason for that is simple. We have been very clear with the Egyptian authorities about the need to make good on their promise to put together an inclusive process that will send that country back to a democratically elected government, and a government that reflects the will of the people, that reflects basic civil rights like the freedom of expression and the right to a peaceful assembly. These are basic rights that should be protected by a democratically elected government. And there is nothing that is ambiguous about that statement, and nothing we've done that is inconsistent with that desire.
Kaz Bai is an American citizen being held in North Korea. There are some reports that former President Jimmy Carter is considering a trip there. Will the White House encourage or discourage that kind of diplomacy?
I refer to the State Department. I've seen those reports. I can tell you that President Carter is traveling to North Korea on a private trip. He's doing that in his personal capacity. But in terms of what conversations we've had with President Carter, I'd refer you to the State Department.
The President, in his New York Times interview, said he is reviewing several extraordinary candidates for the Federal Reserve chairmanship. Is Janet Yellen among them?
I'm not prepared at this point to open up the playbook in terms of the process that's underway for filling that very important job.
Is there anything that you can say in addition to the President's current emphasis on the middle class and the Federal Reserve's interaction with the economy that might help us understand how he's evaluating these extraordinary candidates?
The President did talk about that a little bit in his interview, and I don't think I'm in a position to expand on that at this point.
One last thing before I let you go. I know this is a bit in the weeds, but in 2009, when President first took this office, he delayed the creation of a new Marine One helicopter for his transport. Thursday is the deadline for submission of bids for a new helicopter that the Navy's put together. I'm not going to ask you who's going to win or anything like that, but it appears that the process has been drafted so tightly that there may only be one applicant and the cost may actually be higher, contradicting both of the President's stated goals for delaying in the first place. Do you know anything about whether he's disappointed with this process or thinks this is just something that is inevitable in government contracting? And is he going to take the new helicopter?
Well, I think the thing that he would say if he were standing here is that he would say, well, let's wait till the window closes on this bidding process before we start evaluating how well the bidding process worked. So for details about that bidding process, I'd refer you to the Navy that's conducting this exercise. But certainly the goals that you've articulated and that the President himself has articulated in terms of doing this in a cost-effective way and in a way that continues is to protect the safety of the future presidents who would fly on that aircraft. Those goals remain in place, but in terms of getting to those goals, I'd refer you to the Navy about the process.
So on Friday, there's only one bidder. We can be sure you'll be giving us all the disappointment from the president about this process.
Well, if I'm standing here on Friday, then you can ask. All right, let's go to the back. Leslie.
Josh, are you familiar, or is the White House familiar with a report out of New Zealand that a U.S. intelligence agency were helping its military track the telephone calls of a colleague, a McClatchy journalist, working in Afghanistan at the time?
I'm actually not aware. I've seen those, like the headlines in those reports, but I'm not aware of the story. I would encourage you to either check with the State Department or maybe even the director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Is the White House, at all concerned that raises some questions of if the U.S. intelligence agencies are helping foreign governments track phone calls that could be used to get metadata of U.S. reporters as well?
Well, it's hard for me to express that concern without having read the report. So if you want to touch base later after I've had a chance to take a look at it, then maybe we can talk. But my colleagues at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence should be able to help you with that story. Okay. Ed?
Josh, on government shutdown talk, one of the things that was reported on Friday was the Washington Post saying that the president might be taking a harder line in these negotiations and so wants to do away with the sequester that he might be willing to veto a bill to keep the government open. Is he so determined to do away with the sequester that he'd be willing to shut the government down?
Well, we've been pretty clear about our view that the sequester is bad policy. That's why it was put in the Budget Control Act in the first place, is because it is bad policy. And there are plenty of Republicans who tell you the same thing. So the question does become, what do you do to turn off the sequester, right? Now, the president's put forward a budget where he laid out a very specific plan about how we could turn off the sequester while protecting the critical investments that are so important to expanding economic opportunity for the middle class, while at the same time actually doing more to reduce the deficit than the sequester itself. So we've laid out our plan for how to do that. What the president's most focused on right now, though, is his commitment to ensuring that we maintain the progress we've made in helping our economy recover. We're digging out of the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And we've made a lot of progress over the course of the last 40 consecutive months. The private sector in this country has created 7.2 million jobs. We've got a domestic auto industry that was on the brink of collapse that's now coming back. We've got a housing market that is recovering very nicely. So we've made a lot of progress. The question now is, what are we going to do to maintain that progress? And the president believes that we can maintain that progress by making these investments that are so critical to the middle class, while at the same time staying on the trajectory that we're on that has allowed us to cut the deficit in half over the course of the last 5 years.
Pretty grim message from Jack Lew, as Kristen mentioned, about how the debt ceiling fight, government shutdown fight, could really hurt economic growth. And you get all these looming budget battles, and yet the president is about to go away for a week. Congress is going away far longer than he is. They take basically most of the month of August off. Is any thought being given inside the White House to calling Congress back into session? If this is as desperate a situation as Jack Lew suggested, why is Washington basically going away for the summer?
Well, the prospect of a government shutdown or more drama around the debt ceiling would be bad for the economy. There's no doubt about that. And I think, again, that is a view that is shared by leaders in Congress in both parties. So there is ample time for us, based on that general agreement, there is ample time for us to make sure that doesn't happen. We don't need any more self-inflicted wounds. We saw the damage that could inflict on the economy back in 2011. And so we can avoid that again. It's just a matter of sitting down, rolling up the sleeves, and figuring out what we can do to preserve these investments that are so critical to the middle class. And we can do that without threatening a government shutdown, and we can do that without any drama or delay in making sure that Congress protects the full faith and credit of the United States of America and pays the bills that they've already incurred.
Two other quick things. New York Times has a story today saying one way that Detroit hopes to get out of debt, deal with the bankruptcy situation, is to take some of their retirees who maybe in their early 60s not ready and eligible for Medicare and take them out of city-paid health care and put them into the insurance exchanges that will come in with the president's health care law. My question is, how worried is the White House that Detroit, other cities in trouble, may take some of the health care costs that they don't want to deal with to push
changes in a way that actually makes it more complicated to implement the law and dump some of the cost on the federal government?
Well, I've seen the report. I have not heard a close analysis of this. This is certainly something that we're taking a look at. The one thing I will say, though, is that one of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act is making sure that those Americans that don't get health insurance through their employer are able, for the first time, to go in the open market through these marketplaces and purchase high-quality, affordable health insurance. That is, they can comparison shop, and they can choose the program, the health insurance program, that is best for them and their family. That is something that didn't exist before. So I don't know how this will shake out or what relationship that has to cities that are contemplating a policy option like this. But it's something that at the White House that we're taking a look at.
Last thing, I'm talking about the president's economic tour coming back tomorrow, and you say it focuses on the middle class. Pew had a study back in April about the recovery from 2009 to now, and it was saying that basically under the president's policies, the rich have gotten richer, the middle class has seen income shrinking, as the president himself says out there. The study also said that the rich got even richer in the Bush years, by the way. But point being, how do you go out and make the case and say that this tour is about helping the middle class, when in fact the middle class has seen the rich get richer over the last 4 years?
Well, I think because of the studies that you're citing there, that's actually what's motivating the president's speech. Or the comments that the president's made over the last few days. The president is concerned about the studies like the ones that you cited there. That as we've gone through the recovery, we need to make sure that those benefits are flowing to the middle class. If they don't, if those benefits flow just to the top 1%, what we're going to do is we're going to get back into that boom and bust cycle that actually led to the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression in the first place. So the president wants to make sure that we can put in place a policy regime that will protect investments that are so important to people in the middle class. So again, this is everything from making sure that a college education is open and accessible and affordable to middle class families, that every child in this country has access to a high quality early childhood education program, that middle class families can retire with some measure of dignity and financial stability, that responsible homeowners can take advantage of a strong and recovering housing market, that these are the cornerstones of a middle class life. And those are the kinds of investments the president would like to see, and those are the kinds of investments that are required to make sure that the benefits of this recovery are enjoyed by the middle class. Because if we don't make those kinds of investments, we're going to see the benefits flow just to the top 1%, and we're going to end up in the same boom and bust cycle that led us to the worst economic downturn in the first place.
Yes.
Roger?
Back to the Fed for a moment. About a third of the Senate Democratic caucus wrote to the president late last week. You're familiar with the letter as recommending Yellen. One, can you release that letter? And second, how does a letter such as that affect the president's selection process?
As I recall from the reports, that was a letter that was being circulated and had been signed by some members. I don't know that it's actually been sent to us. I haven't seen it if it has. But my guess is, well, based on my experience working with my colleagues on Capitol Hill, that if you ask them to release the letter, I'm sure that there are dozens of people who'd be happy to do so.
About the selection process?
Well, as I told Major, your interest in this is certainly understandable, and I think that there are a lot of people across the country who are interested in this process. But I don't want to weigh in at this point to try to, even with the best of intentions and my desire to try to steer you in the right direction, I'm concerned that my carefully scrutinized words might cause some to overinterpret what I would say and lead you to the wrong conclusion. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to accomplish here. So the president talked about this a little bit with the New York Times. The transcript of that interview was published in the New York Times on Sunday. That should give you some pretty good insight into how the president is approaching this decision that needs to be made.
It would be fair to say that you'll give the recommendation some weight, would it not?
The letter. We're back to the letter again.
I mean, he doesn't ignore it, right?
Well, look, he's the President of the United States, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve is an appointee of the President of the United States. So I think ignore might be too strong of a word, but I think the President has the sure, but that's their advise and consent role, right? So they have a role in this process, but the President's role is to appoint someone. It's the Senate's role in this process to evaluate those appointees. So we'll go through that process. I think the President has made clear in that interview that this is something he's been thinking about for some time, and I think he has his own pretty strongly held ideas about what he'd like to see there. Okay. Ann?
Thank you very much, Josh. You mentioned that 2016 is pretty far off, but do you think at some point the president will want to express his choice of who might be the best Democrat to run for president? And was Vice President Biden invited to the lunch today?
Well, as you know, Ann, the Vice President has lunch with the President on a weekly basis, so I don't know if he was joining the lunch. As I mentioned to you before, I think the table was set for 2. But I would anticipate that the president will continue to have lunch on a weekly basis with the vice president. In terms of whether or not he'll weigh in 2016, I think it's far too early to tell. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people, probably even you, who will ask him about that. But I'm not going to commit him one way or the other at this point.
And how will he measure the impact of these economic speeches, such as the one he'll give tomorrow? Is there some kind of feedback by which the White House figures, yes, these are working, or no, they're not?
That's a good question. I think the goal of these speeches is to try to recenter the debate. That for so long we spent a lot of time focused on debts and deficits and getting that under control. And as I pointed out, we made tremendous progress here in terms of cutting that deficit in half over the course of the last 5 years. So what the president wants to do is to redouble his efforts to put the interests of middle-class families back at the center of that debate. Certainly middle-class families have something to gain from the progress we've made in terms of reducing the deficit, but there's a lot more that we can do to help middle-class families, and that's what the president's focused on right now.
How do you decide whether or not this series of speeches is working?
Well, I think what we'll do is we'll evaluate the debate in the weeks and months ahead, and I would concede that that is a rather nebulous criteria. But I think it's important nonetheless for the American people to understand what the president's policymaking priority is. It certainly is important for Congress to understand what the president's priorities are. And I think that there are certainly Democrats and maybe even some Republicans who share the president's view that we should put middle-class families front and center of this debate. That's what the president's committed to doing, and hopefully we'll have a debate that reflects those priorities. So, David.
Josh, later today, a few minutes maybe, I think the White House is coming out with a report on immigration, talking about the positive economic benefits, but the House looks like they're going to break this week without taking any significant action on reform. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how the White House, the president in particular, will use the congressional recess to press the case. Will he go out and talk about it publicly, and how so?
Well, there is a report that's slated for release later this afternoon, and I understand that the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, will be talking about the findings of that report. So I don't want to get out ahead of what announcements he may be making, but I certainly commend to all of you that report that has some important conclusions about the economic impact and the economic benefits, I should say, of comprehensive immigration reform, including in smaller communities all across the country. In terms of the president's activities over August, his calendar is still coming together for that month. Unlike Congress, the president will be at work for most of that month. And I would anticipate that you'll hear him talking about the importance of finally making some progress in comprehensive immigration reform. The president himself has said that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally fix a broken immigration system, and we've made significant progress by working in bipartisan fashion in the Senate to build strong bipartisan support for that legislation. There's now also strong support all across the country in faith communities and law enforcement communities, among business leaders and leaders in organized labor for that compromise piece of legislation. So we would anticipate that that momentum will continue to build for that piece of legislation, and we'll see.
You've lost momentum or to the point where it's behind schedule, that especially with the debt ceiling and other things and the budget coming up in September being such an important part of the focus, is immigration just going to be pushed back farther?
I won't deny that we would be perfectly happy for the House of Representatives to pass that bipartisan legislation today and have a signing ceremony at the end of the week. I don't anticipate that's going to happen. But I do think that there's pretty strong momentum built up behind this piece of legislation, that we really have built a strong coalition of people that often aren't getting together on pieces of legislation. When you see both the business community and the labor community strongly supporting a piece of legislation, you know that something pretty interesting is happening. When you see the evangelical community weighing in strongly on a piece of legislation that the president's eager to sign, that's sometimes a pretty good indication that there's something unusual going on. So there's some strong support for this, not just in Washington and not just in both parties in Washington, but among communities all across the country. And I think that momentum is only building. And we'll see how House Republicans respond to that pressure.
Can I follow up immigration?
Can you talk about why Chattanooga tomorrow and why that speech will be different from the 3 previous speeches?
What the president's going to be focused on tomorrow in Chattanooga policies that we can put in place that will support the private sector as they create jobs and continue to lead this recovery. There are the President alluded to this a little bit in his remarks in Jacksonville, where he talked about how infrastructure improvements and efforts to modernize the port in Jacksonville have led to some job creation and expanded economic activity, not just in Jacksonville, but in the region. So there is a role for the government to play in supporting the private sector as they continue to create jobs and lead this recovery back from the worst recession since the Great Depression. So the President will be speaking at a Amazon fulfillment center in Chattanooga. And I read in the newspaper today that Amazon has committed to hiring another 5,000 workers at those fulfillment centers located all across the country. That's the kind of investment that we're starting to see more of, that if we can put in place policies that will encourage companies to invest in America, to bring back jobs from overseas, that if we can invest in the kind of infrastructure that's required to allow companies to get products to market more quickly or to their customers more quickly, that's certainly something that we want to encourage. That other companies are making that kind of investment to modernize their infrastructure, and we should be making that kind of investment here in this country as well.
Thanks, Josh.
I'll do a couple more in the back. JC?
You made it very clear that the President is not directly involved in these talks, and that is the purview of the Secretary of State. What encouraging conversations has the President had, or does he look forward to having with the leaders in NATO, for example, Prime Minister Cameron, etc., because obviously they are part of this whole world concept as well?
I don't have any specific calls to read out to you at this point, but the President and other officials in this administration are in close touch with our allies as we work to bring both the Palestinians and the Israelis to the table. As I alluded to in a previous question, I think from Mark, the world, many countries all around the world do have a pretty substantial stake in the outcome of these conversations. And this is something that the world community, and certainly with our allies and partners in the region, have been working on for quite some time. And it's something that, as somebody also pointed out, the previous presidents have worked on. So there is a lot of very difficult work ahead, and we're only going to be able to make progress if our allies and our partners in the region are supportive of the process and work to encourage the Israelis and Palestinians to take the necessary steps to continue down this path toward peace. That's certainly what we'll be encouraging, but ultimately that is a choice and a set of decisions that will be left up to the Israelis and Palestinians to make.
And bringing in the Brits and the French at this point, it has been going on, or the President looks forward to that?
Well, we certainly are going to rely on our allies to support this process, and there is an important role for our allies to play in, as I mentioned, sort of cajoling and encouraging and facilitating the kinds of conversations that are going to lead, that will hopefully lead to some progress. Okay. Alexis, I'll give you the last one.
Josh, at the Knox College speech, the President talked about something economists have talked about, is the problem of the long-term unemployed. Can you elaborate on what he had to say about hoping that private sector employers would hire or look for ways to hire those individuals, whether he has an initiative in mind for that? Is there anything the federal government can do along the lines of hiring veterans to encourage that to occur?
I don't want to get ahead of the President's speech tomorrow, so I'd encourage you to tune in. But if you've talked to Alan Kruger or Gene Sperling or any of the President's other senior economic advisors, Secretary Lew would certainly tell you this as well, that one of the things that we're concerned about are those who have been unemployed for 6 months or longer. That we want to make sure that there continues to be economic opportunity and an opportunity for a job for people who are in that situation. And that's something that's very difficult right now and is a thorny and a rather persistent problem in this country. And so we are considering some initiatives that would try to provide some assistance to those who've been looking for a job for quite some time. But with that, I'll leave it there and encourage you to tune into the President's speech tomorrow.
One other quick follow-up. The President had suggested that we might see him as Congress departs, so he would get a chance maybe at a news conference to talk about this break coming up and what he expects to see in the fall. Can we expect to see him this week?
I don't want to announce the President's schedule for the remainder of the week, but as you know, the President does on occasion like to come out here and talk to you a little bit about what he's been thinking about and take some questions. So I don't have a date to tease out right now, but that's certainly something that the President's interested in doing. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good Monday.
Be back tomorrow?
Mr. Carney will be on the road with the President tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.